Good morning. This is Robin Meyer. I'm with the East Cobb Quilters Guild, and this is another edition of Who We Are, a series of videos designed to introduce our members to each other and to the community at large. And this morning we're talking to Lynn Rinehart. Lynn's been a member of the Guild for quite some time and very active in it. And today we're going to talk with Lynn about a number of things, including her work as an appraiser and her special interest in appraising contemporary quilts. But to get started, Lynn, welcome. And why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got started quilting?
That's just a happenstance kind of story. I think my what happened was my aunt had this habit of collecting experiences and not necessarily things. So she decided that she wanted to go to some museum that was opening. And I was in grad school and I wanted to spend the day with my aunt. So I actually skipped conversation analysis and decided to go to my aunt to this new museum that was opening in Paducah, Kentucky. So I was at the opening of the Quilt Museum in Paducah, Kentucky, and actually went to an AQS quilt show when I was in grad school. And I think I walked through the place and went, "Oh, you can do this with fabric." I was blown away by it. I actually had gone to college at Murray State University and grew up in Southern Illinois. So I would stop at Hancock's on the way home from college and just look at all the fabric. And then to have this, when I got to grad school, to have this like, oh my gosh, you can make quilts. What, I think it was the genesis of the very beginning. And then when I moved to Atlanta, I decided I had heard about there's this block of the month program and ended up at Little Quilts on the wrong Saturday. They used to have a block of the month, second Saturday of the month, and I ended up there the wrong Saturday. And someone was teaching a beginning class, and I was like, she's like, go upstairs and pick out some fabric, and I can, you can take this class today. So, I guess serendipity. I ended up in a class um, and learned how to make half square triangles. And then the next Saturday I ended up at Block of the Month. And that was my journey into this is how you piece, this is how you do this. So it was kind of those two really major events that set me on the path.
So when did you move to Atlanta? How long ago was that?
So I moved to Atlanta in 98.
Okay.
And I think I joined the guild not too long thereafter. It was after we bought our house. So we've been here since 2000 and in our home. And I think I was like 2006 because I kind of discovered the show and went, oh, and y'all had a night meeting. We have a night meeting. And I was working full time. So it was the only guild kind of when I started researching, can I find a guild to be involved in that was at night? And
Right.
so it allowed me to join the guild at I want to say a younger age than a retirement age,
Right.
and get involved at a younger age. And so that's allowed me to be quilting. I mean, it's been 20 plus years now. So
Yeah. I think we joined not too far apart actually. And yeah, it just the world's your oyster. It seems like it just opens it up.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm a big champion of the night meetings. So
They're great. They're great.
yeah.
And you should and you've played a role in carrying them on, I believe.
Yeah. Well, I've never been the leader of it or anything, but definitely supported, those and volunteered for the different things that, they're involved in. Yeah.
So I know that you're a certified appraiser. So tell us a little bit about that process and what got you thinking about doing that.
I was at a night meeting and the guild had contracted an appraiser to come in and talk about quilts. And at the time I was still, really new to sewing and those kinds of things. And this appraiser came in and started talking about the journey of how to learn to be an appraiser. And I went, you know what? Because I had been to the quilt show, and I think when you're new, you look at the ribbon winning quilts and go, I could never do that. And I was intimidated by the skill level and stuff, and thinking, I am still doing good to get a 1/4 inch seam. And she's talked about the love, you have to have a love of history. And as we sit here right before the show, I was watching an FDR documentary. I love history. um, so I decided that I could do that. And she said, well, you have to go take classes at Paducah. Well, my family lives close to Paducah. So I was able to kind of go, hey, can I go stay at my aunt's house and, kind of travel back and forth to Paducah. And I had my husband at the time, and I didn't have the same amount of vacation days, and I had more. And so it was an opportunity that I was like, well, I'll go to the show, and they let you sign up for classes. And, and somehow I got into the appraisal class, which is at the time was hard to get into because they limited the number of students. But I will kind of walk through the door and said, I'd like to learn how to do this. And they embraced me and sent me off on my way. And it was just a journey of there was another appraiser in Georgia that I kind of shadowed a bit, and honestly support from you, Robin, and some other quilters in the guild saying, yeah, we want you to learn how to do this, and encouraged me on the journey. And I didn't pass the first time I submitted my application, and the next time I went to the show that year, and they said, why aren't you taking the test? And I'm like, you wouldn't let me. And they're like, you're ready. And I'm like, yay. So I took the test the next year and passed. So that's it took about 4 or 5 years to get it done. I really feel like it's a doctorate. I don't have my doctorate in university setting, but it was a all day test and written exam. And then you had the oral exam where they set a panel in front of you and you had to appraise quilts while they were evaluating you. So,
and a big piece of appraisal, as I understand it, is to understand and be knowledgeable about the materials, the practices, the techniques that have been used in quilts, not just in the immediate past, but back centuries and maybe around the world.
It is. And you do learn all of that kind of things because there's such a history of blocks and, how they're some blocks have, 30 names to them, depending upon what region of the country they were in and who published it and all that kind of stuff. And we're still doing that today. I do it. I'll take a block and, rename it for my pattern.
Right.
Kind of thing. So that being true, but another way the guild was extremely helpful to me is because we bring in these national teachers, I'm able to list out, I understand, and I take almost all the classes. I really am a class fan. I'm a learner. I'm a student. I love learning. As much as I love teaching, I love learning. Because you guys, East Cobb brings in so many different instructors, it allowed me to learn all these different techniques from some of the top people in our niche, in our industry. And then when I'm put in front of a quilt, like I can go, that is machine applique that looks like needle turn. And I can tell because I know the technique well enough to be able to go. And it was funny. I was at a quilt show, one of our shows, and I was appraising a quilt from a friend of ours. And so I knew what technique she was using. And this lady was like, this is needle turn applique. And I'm appraising it going, it's not, it's machine. And she's like, you're wrong. And walked away. I was like, well, okay.
And so,
but, it is what it is.
It is. It definitely is. So tell us a little bit about how you ascertain value, because I know that many people get a quilt appraised because of insurance, potential insurance claim, or because they're donating it perhaps and they need that to document it, or honestly they're just curious,
or they're giving it to their son and they don't want it to be a car mat.
right?
I get those. I really do. So there's two ways to ascertain value. The first way is fair market, and the second way is reconstruction. So fair market is where I go and I look at, and these are more for vintage and antique type of quilts. They cannot be remade with today's fabrics and be the same thing. So
Right.
if I'm looking at a quilt that has fabric from the 1930s, you can't really go to the store and buy 1930s fabric. You can buy reproduction of 1930s fabric, but it's not 1930s fabric. So it's not authentic to that decade, to that time frame. So that's a fair market value. And you kind of have to look at that like the antique kind of world, where what is it being sold for on the fair market. So if you're looking at a 1930s grandmother's flower garden quilt, those quilts are going to have a certain price point of what they're selling on the fair market. And I kind of haunt the auction sites and, just kind of keep up with those types of things and know what those are type of quilts are selling for. And then that helps determine the fair market value. So I'm really looking at comps,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right? But it has to be from an educated seller and an educated buyer. So if an educated seller is selling a quilt, or an uneducated seller is selling a quilt for $10, that's not a fair comp,
Right.
because that seller didn't know what they had. And the buyer may know what they're selling and go, yeah, I'll give you $10 for it, knowing it's worth 800.
Right.
Right. So that's not, so you can't take into rummage sales, or because those aren't always educated buyers. And eBay is not necessarily the best place either, because sometimes they think they're educated and they're really not, so you really have to look at what antique dealers and quilt dealers and those are selling those for at that price.
Okay.
The other one is reconstruction. And this is what contemporary quilts are really based on. Reconstruction is, what does it cost to make that today at today's prices? And I will even say, when I started appraising, you could buy fabric for $8 a yard. So you would say, okay, this piece, this quilt in front of me is, this 9-patch type of quilt, $8 a yard. I'm assuming there's 7 yards in it, 50, then how much they've spent on it to buy the fabric. And then you have to do fabric time to do the whatever technique that is. And let's just say, that's, do you pay yourself minimum wage? Maybe for a, 9-patch, maybe for a double wedding ring. That's a little bit more complicated and a higher skill level to do all that curve piecing. So I understand that that's another level. So to me, that's not minimum wage. So how long does it take someone to do curve piecing? How long does it take someone to do paper piecing? How long does it take someone, you know what I mean? So I have to
Right.
look at the time. So understanding and having have done all of those techniques, I understand, what's the difference in how long it takes to do needle turn applique to machine applique to, depending upon what it is. So that's reconstruction. So I have to look at the time. So I look at the cost of materials. I look at the time. I look at the quilting cost. Is it just an overall meander? Is it machine? Is it hand? Is it, and here's a misnomer, hand is not worth as much value wise as a price point as some computerized and machine quilting is. And that's because when you look at who does hand quilting out in the public, which is Amish communities mostly, I will say even here in Georgia, you cannot, I have not found a resource where you can pay someone day and quilt a quilt for you. You are sending it off to an Amish community that you find online, and they will quilt it for you. So what they're charging is what I have to value at. Right.
Okay.
Because it's like apples to apples, right?
Right.
So if I'm looking at a quilt and it's hand quilted, I'm gonna have to look at what that costs.
Right.
And I can't just make it up and go, it's really hard and it takes a long time. I have to look at what they're charging for in the marketplace.
Right.
So, and then when you think about computerized quilting or just long arm quilting, as far much as I do, is that there's a wide variety. So I have to look at what they're talking about. Is this free motion? Is it custom? Is it what kind of custom? Is it, thread painting?
Right.
Those kinds of things. So I take all of those things and kind of look at and like even when I am around other long armors, I'm always asking them, what are you charging today for your quilts? Like for long arming, because I want to know, not because I'm going to bring anything to them, but just because when people bring stuff to me, I know what the area is charging for this kind of quilting average.
Right.
Not everybody charges the same thing, average.
Right.
And so I look at all that, take that into consideration, and that kind of where the pricing comes in.
That's a
For value.
complicated undertaking.
It is. And I will say my favorite, and not that I don't love the antique or vintage quilts, and I would say I see mostly those, but my favorite quilts to appraise are the new ones, because I don't think people realize as quilters how much really monetarily we have in these priceless, very unique items. I think we put this value on art of painting and go, well, that's an original painting. You realize your quilt's an original quilt, right? Like, and I don't see that people take that into consideration, and they have no problem looking at a painting and going, yeah, I'll pay $3,000 for that. And then being offended when somebody says, yeah, this quilt's worth $3,000, and going, and I'm like, but you've got 11 yards of fabric in it at $13 a yard.
For starters.
For starters.
Right.
That's not your time. That's not the quilting. That's not the batting. That's not the binding, so like I really like that kind of inspiration of showing quilters today how much they are worth. And we are such generous group of people that we give all of this away in a very loving manner. But I just want people to understand the value that they're really giving away. It's not just, something to cover your bed. It's a priceless work of art in a lot of ways.
So do you see a trend towards more contemporary quilters interested in appraisals?
I do. I think the show world fosters that, because I do get quilts coming to me that get sent to shows, and in an insurance world, like, you want to have your quilt appraised before you send it anywhere. And the reason is, if something happens to it, you're lucky if they're going to give you the cost of materials.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not your time, and it's not the quilting, and it's not all those other things that kind of make the quilt what it is. So, and I'm getting ready to send 2 quilts actually to a show in Tennessee. And I'm like, I'm thinking about buying an air tag and slipping it into my behind my label, because I want to know that I know exactly where it's such an important quilt to my life. I want to know exactly where that one quilt is. So.
Right. Well, I think it's an act of faith to ship a quilt.
It is completely. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely an act of faith. So where do you see the appraisal field going? Do you think that the emphasis is, I think most appraisers probably see historical quilts most often.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's my experience. I haven't talked to because there's only 2 of us, and the other one lives in Savannah. But yeah, I see most historical, and I think people who are drawn to the appraisal process are drawn to the historical aspect of it. So, and there's nothing wrong with that. I love historical quilts. That being said, I as an artist, as a quilt artist, I think contemporary quilts are my favorite. Just because I like the new.
Right. So when contemporary quilters come to you for an appraisal, is it typically because they are entering a show, or maybe they've won something and they're interested in you?
Yeah, 2 reasons. One, they're entering a show, or they've won something. Yes. The other reason is they're giving it away to someone that they're not sure that that person's going to appreciate it. And so with the appraisal kind of in the package, and they open it up and go, oh, yeah. I think it adds value to the gift.
Yeah. Well, I know that there's a confidential aspect to what you do,
Oh,
but
absolutely.
is there an appraisal experience you've had that you can sort of blur the names of the um, names and specifics of the quilt and tell us something really, really amazing that's happened to you?
Okay, so there's two. First one, it was just a couple of months ago up in the museum at Cartersville. There was a lady in the area, and these are the children descendants. It was their great aunt or something, that have a crazy quilt that is literally Smithsonian level crazy quilt. I have never seen one as amazing as this. If you go to up to Cartersville, the Museum of Cartersville, you can see this quilt. It's incredible. I'm going to tell you three actually. The other quilt that's amazing that you can see is a border per se quilt that I got to appraise, and it's down at the museum in Carrollton. And it is from the 1700s. And literally, someone dropped that quilt off at the front desk of the museum and said, I don't know what to do with this. If y'all don't want it, we're just going to burn it. And it was a 1700 border per se quilt. I mean, you do not see those two types of quilts outside of like really historical high-end museums, and Georgia's got two of them in local area.
Right.
The third one is owned by someone here in Georgia. It's not in a museum. It should be in a museum. To my knowledge, I haven't seen this person in a few years. They brought this quilt to me. I was up at a show in North Georgia. This lady comes in with a suitcase on, wheels kind of thing. And she walks in the room, and I was working with somebody, and she said, I said, if you want to leave that here and go shop or look at the other quilts, I'm going to be in here. And I said, but I need to finish with this person. She said, oh no, I'm not leaving this. And I was like, okay, you be you. I'm good with that. So she walked out of the room. I finished. She came back in, and she opens up the suitcase, and it's the heaviest quilt I ever held in my life. And we unfolded it, looked at it on the table, and then she started telling me the story. And the story was that this quilt's provenance came from a museum that was being shut down in upstate New York. And it originally came from a hospital in the Washington, D.C. area right after the Civil War. And it was being used, or it came about as a project for the wounded soldiers to sew. Of course, they all sewed back then. So it's not weird to think about, a man sewing
Right.
like they did. They repaired stuff. And so they had cut up Union and Confederate uniforms. And this quilt is pieces of their uniforms. And I'll send you that picture so you can see it. But it's pieces of their uniforms that were sewn together, and they did embroidery on it or whatever. So it is one of the most fantastic quilts I've ever seen in my life, just from the historical aspect to it. Because not only was it medical, but you've got Civil War,
Right.
You've got war just in itself, then you've got quilting. So the niche aspect of it is a lot of different collectability. And when you look at sometimes the historical quilts, you look at that, like who would want to own this, like
Right.
what type of people would find this item interesting. So you're looking at doctors and medical military people and quilters, and so it had a lot of those type of niches. But it's an incredible quilt. And I have to admit, it was one of my favorite quilts I've ever seen.
That's amazing. That's an
Yeah.
amazing story. Yeah. And
And they're all here in Georgia.
yeah.
All of Georgia.
Well, and two of the three on public display too.
Right.
So
Yeah.
way cool. Way cool. Well, Lynn, this has been grand. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. And um, I wish you many, many more years of discovering crazy cool quilts this way. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.